behavior, there's really not a lot on the table that the president can offer.
Absolutely. And so in the Iran, in the sort of the a macro sense, in the Iran negotiations, the basic trade was we will relieve sanctions if you change your behavior. But in much more micro sense, I had any number of conversations with financial institutions and others where I made very clear that if you proceed down this path, sanctions will result. But if you proceed down this path, we'll be able to relieve them. If my successor doesn't have that flexibility to use sanctions, I think, as I said, in the way that they were designed, which is to change behavior, if it sort of locks in what is essentially a punishment, then you've fundamentally altered the sanctions tool in a way that I think makes it much less useful for us going forward.
I'll, I guess, end with one last sort of series of questions that are tied together. When we were discussing North Korea and North Korea sanctions, we talked about how important it was to have the Chinese on our side, even though they are effectively a third part. Well, certainly the nuclearization of the Korean Peninsula has global implications. But, when it comes to Russia, the Europeans are very much involved, and they have their own interests. And there are challenges when it comes to multilateralizing sanctions in a way that gets some of our European partners on board.
Right.
Maybe if you could just offer one or two comments or observations as to how that can be implemented. And then finally, even as you return to private practice, lots of private market participants have questions, both about the evolution of sanctions, the clarity of policy that would allow them to sort of stay ahead of the regulatory curve. How do you go about dealing with that particular challenge?
It's interesting. Actually, those two things are closely tied, the market participants and how the Europeans look at sanctions. They are, as a rule, the Europeans tend to be much more responsive, I think, to the concerns of their business community than we have been here. And so in the Russia sanctions, we spent a lot of time working with the EU to try to have as much parity between what we were doing on Russia sanctions and what the Europeans were doing. And we got basically there. And, and to some extent, what the Europeans were willing to do was a governor on what we were prepared to do, because we didn't want to get out ahead of the Europeans. And if you look at sort of comparative economic exposure, Europeans were way more exposed to Russia than we were, and if they weren't prepared to take a certain step, it didn't make any sense for us to do it. So, in that context, we worked very hard to try to have an ongoing dialogue with European counterparts, or at the EU level or at the member state level, to ensure that we were walking more or less in lockstep. Again, that was in part because the Europeans were hearing from their businesses that had much more exposure to Russia about the impact there. Another sort of interesting side effect of the evolution of sanctions from broad sort of trade embargoes to what we have today, which are much more tailored, much more specific, and frankly, much more complex sanctions, is that for businesses operating in the international environment, it's a much more difficult environment to navigate. I mean, if it was a Cuba embargo which said, thou shalt not sell anything to Cuba, pretty easy to figure out what you're supposed to do. The Russia sanctions, or what the administration just did in Venezuela, which were a series of sanctions on the Venezuelan government and the Venezuelan oil company, PDVSA's access to the U.S. capital markets, that's a really sort of complex application of a sanctions tool that I think is smart. It was a sort of a cut and paste job from the Russia sanctions to the Venezuela sanctions. I mean that actually in a positive sense, because I think that the Russia sanctions were pretty innovative and smart, and I think using it in the Venezuela context, could be smart as well. But it's a complex environment now for, particularly for U.S. financial institutions to navigate.
Wonderful. Okay, with that, I know that we have a good number of folks here from the press as well as students. We have two microphones. We really do ask that you go to the microphones to ask any questions that you may have and to identify yourself. And we already have someone up to bat.
Thank you so much. Josh Rogan, Washington Post. Thank you for your time today, and thank you for your service. I want to ask you about the Iran nuclear deal and the sanctions related to that, the JCPOA. As you may have followed, of course, we can never know what President Trump is going to do until he does it. But if we read the tea leaves and we listen to what Ambassador Nikki Haley said last week at the American Enterprise Institute, it seems pretty clear they're heading towards this policy somewhere between just tanking the deal and endorsing it, right? They call it waive the sanctions, decertify the deal, kick it to Congress. Congress can then either put on the sanctions or do nothing, or put on different sanctions that aren't the nuclear sanctions, but they're, it still sends a message. This is what's going on. Does any of that make sense to you? And does this seem like, from the perspective of someone who was instrumental in sort of how the JCPOA and those sanctions came about, that seem like that's going to work, a middle road approach where we with the Trump administration sort of disparages the deal, but then tries to save it, but then kicks it to Congress. Nobody knows what's going to happen. How do you see that playing out? Thank you.
I think the short answer is I think it's too clever by half. That if the administration wants to tank the deal and give it to Congress to figure out how to, whether to reimpose sanctions, that it doesn't get them away from the problem that the rest of the world is not prepared to back away from this deal and doesn't see any reason to do so. You had, it was last week or the week before last, the IAEA come out with its latest report on Iran's compliance with the deal, and the IAEA said Iran is complying in all material respects with its obligations in the deal. That is going to be persuasive to the Europeans and to the Russians and the Chinese and to others who are not participants in the negotiation. And the Trump administration, particularly, as I've written, concluding based on the president's sort of preordained request that that Iran's not complying with the deal, will persuade no one around the world. And so the difficulty is we can then, and this goes back to what we were talking about earlier, we can then reimpose sanctions. And Congress has shown over the years a great interest in imposing sanctions on Iran. So for all I know, they will do so again. But it's not going to bring the world along with us. And what worked previously is that we had the world with us. That created the pressure that led to the negotiation. And if the Trump administration's idea is that we will somehow get a better deal, we're going to back out of this one, we'll renegotiate and get a better one. Well, you need leverage to get a better deal. That leverage is, at least part of that leverage comes from sanctions pressure. And I just don't think that we're going to be able to regenerate effective sanctions pressure on Iran. In the meantime, we're going to create a whole bunch of friction with allies and quasi-allies and not so much allies around the world. So I am not sanguine about this move. So.
My name is, let's start with me.
I'm sorry, I think you were second and then third, or?
Go ahead.
Go ahead, ladies first.
Okay. Hi, Jessica Schulberg, Huffington Post. Thank you for coming. You mentioned towards the beginning of your remarks that you think it's time to sort of turn up the heat on North Korea, specifically with regards to China, that we've sort of tried everything else, and there is a lot more that...
Hold on one second. I can't do two things at once. Okay, sorry.
No worries.
Can you start again?
You mentioned towards the beginning of your remarks that you think we should turn up the heat on China with relation to North Korea, and that there's a lot more that they could do in terms of sanction policy and that we could do through secondary sanctions. Can you describe what the thinking was during the Obama administration on this? I mean, they obviously did not do this, and obviously there's a lot of talk on this. Like, what was the hesitance? Where was it coming from? What was the reason that that policy ultimately was not taken?
Yeah, yeah, sure, to some extent. The debate about what to do to try to bring, which really are, to try to bring China more into the game on North Korea has to be considered in light of all that we've got going on with China, and that means trade issues. It means South China Sea. It means cyber issues. It means China's relation with its neighbors in the region. The One Belt One Road initiative. I mean, we have a huge number of really important issues with China, and you can't put pressure on all of those issues simultaneously. You've got to pick and choose a little bit, and that was the debate then. That's the debate now. It ought to be the debate now anyway. I'm obviously not in the room, but I'm sure that these other considerations are being brought to the fore. And so just my personal view is that we need to prioritize the North Korean nuclear issue. That means we're going to have to let other stuff go. You can try to thread those needles as best you can, but you can't do everything. And I think that's the fundamental conundrum in this, is that we've got a lot of things with China that matter a lot to us, but we just have to take a sort of clear-eyed view of what the North Korean threat is and what we want to do about it. Now, can I just say one other thing about the North Korean threat? For sure, a North Korea with a nuclear-capable ICBM that can range the U.S. is a serious problem. As we sort of figure out what to do about this in the near term, need to avoid taking what is an urgent and important national security problem and turning it into a crisis. And the best way to do that is to make Kim Jong-un think that we are about to invade and overthrow his regime. And so we were talking earlier about there being a little bit of policy churn on the North Korea issue. You've seen some people in the administration talk about diplomacy and sanctions. Those tend to be the people in the military. And then you've seen other people in the administration talking about locked and loaded and fire and fury. Those tend to be people who don't have any experience with military matters. And I think we need to be careful that we don't, in this period where we're trying to figure out if there is a way to try to reduce the risk of a North Korean nuclear and ballistic missile program, we don't inadvertently get ourselves into a shooting war with North Korea. That would be a disaster. So.
Excuse me.
Thank you. My name is Steve Hirsch. I'm a freelance journalist.
We got to get to some students.
What?
Go ahead, but we got to get some students.
Bring it.
Okay. All right. Could you tell me your appointment as deputy director, as a sanctions guy, as deputy director, CIA, did that reflect some sort of shift in intelligence, do you think? And if it did, do you think that shift has continued?
So I don't, this is going to be a really unsatisfying answer. I think the answer is no. I don't think that, I don't think that my appointment as deputy director was because of the work I did. It wasn't to bring sort of financial sanctions into the agency. I think there was a whole host of other reasons that Director Brennan reached out to me. But it wasn't that there was a view. I don't think, someone should ask John this question. I never actually asked him this question, but I don't think it was, gee, we've got this hole we need to fill in the agency on financial intelligence or financial sanctions, and let's bring this guy in, he'll fill that hole. I don't think that's what it was.
Okay, thanks.
Freddie.
Hi, my name is Freddie Whitlow. I'm an administrative assistant here for Professor Brummer. My question is with regards to the threat to Russia. You see a very troubling trend in the Trump administration of several apologists for Russia in particular. Everything from kind of a passive, oh shucks, it's just Putin, to apologists that you look going all the way back to the election campaign with Manafort, Bannon, Flynn, so on. Thankfully, several of them have been shown the door now. But at what point is this administration in particular going to actually start addressing the Russian threat up front? So you see this, you see statements from Mattis, for example, who are completely contrary to the kind of this passive nature. And at what point, or what is it going to take for the United States to quit playing defense with the Russians in particular and start going on the offense and start making it clear there's going to be a very steep price for meddling in our affairs and meddling in the affairs of our allies?
Yeah. I don't know the answer to that question. I left on January 20th at 11:59 a.m. Right? And so, I have not been part of this current administration. And as I said earlier, I do think that there's a need, in particular on the cyber-enabled information operation front, for a more robust response, and equally importantly, to get ourselves into a position to defend ourselves better. I mean, one of the things that I've heard people say, which I disagree with, which is that the Russians have been at this for a long time. In some respects, this is nothing new. They've done this before. I just think that fundamentally misses the point. This is, for sure, the Russians have done information ops in the past. They used to try to infiltrate, student groups or whatever. But this was an attack on our democracy. And it was very sophisticated, and it was using tools and means that didn't exist previously. And that's something I think we need to come to grips with as a country. But to answer your question, I don't know when or if this administration is going to sort of take a more aggressive posture on that issue.
Okay with that. Okay, I think we have about 4 more minutes, so perhaps we can take all 3 questions and then bring them your way. Okay.
Okay, thanks. This is Ellen Nakashima with the Washington Post, not to double team you here, but following up on this question, staying in the Russian theme, you said earlier that you found it deeply disturbing that this administration had not gone after this issue on Russia. What more would you like to see them do? Do you think they can do? And why didn't the Obama administration do so? Or perhaps you did consider it, and if so, can you let us know that?
I'm just going to have all 3,
Okay.
and you can.
Okay.
Yes, please.
My question deals with North Korea.
Do you want to identify yourself
Oh,
first?
I'm Susan, and I'm an alum.
Okay, great.
A law student?
An alum.
An alum.
Of the
Okay,
law
close
school.
enough. Okay, good.
Of the law school. That's
Great.
But my question is dealing with North Korea and pressure on China. If China's interests are actually against a unified Korea in the South, what do you believe that sanctions will accomplish as opposed to a carrot? And what are some carrots that might exist? Because it's constantly pressuring China to do something they don't want to do. Maybe the opposite would be more helpful. So that's just my question.
Hi, my name is Khalid Kamal. I'm from Saudi Arabia, and I'm a 2L student.
All right. Fine.
We had classes, so it was a bit
I know.
tough getting here. But thanks for being here. I'm writing a paper on sanctions with my national security course, and my question seems to me that just from the data I have, that sanctions on, for example, Iran and North Korea haven't really prevented them from getting to their goals, their ultimate goals of getting their nuclear power. So I don't see sanctions being as effective as we would imagine them to be. So should policy change on sanctions, or should there be more engagement? How effective are sanctions, essentially? That's the question. Thank you.
So let me try and do these in reverse order and do them quickly. The question about the effectiveness of sanctions is a complicated one because I think you need to control for a number of different variables. You need to control for the type of sanction that is being applied. And so you can't, I don't think you can compare, the Iran sanctions to the Cuba sanctions. They're both called sanctions, but it's, but the analogy I have is I've recently read this book called The Emperor of All Maladies it's a history of cancer. It's a great book, fantastic book, won the Pulitzer Prize. Cancer covers like a huge range of different problems. And calling something a sanction covers a huge range of different actual policy tools. So I think you need to control for that variable. You need to control for what the policy objective is, right? What are you trying to have the sanctions accomplish? If what you're trying to do is to, end the nuclear program, that's one thing. If what you're trying to do is to disable someone's ability to fund terrorism, that's a different problem. And so, and you sort of go down the list. So I think there is no sort of one sort of pat answer to whether sanctions are effective or can be effective. I think properly tailored sanctions used in an appropriate foreign policy or national security context, with sort of enough flexibility given to the Treasury Department and others in the administration to apply them in a way that is flexible. I think that I am a believer that sanctions can be quite effective, but you can also make a hash of it, and I just think so. You got to figure out how to do it the right way. North Korea and China, if I understood the question, I think for the Chinese, as I said, sort of to have them be more part of the effort here to put some constraints on North Korea's nuclear program and ultimately get to the complete and verifiable denuclearization of the peninsula, it has to be a combination of carrots and sticks. We're not going to get the Chinese to work with us, purely by imposing sanctions, secondary sanctions on their businesses or their financial institutions, and nor, frankly, should we want to do that. It would be enormously disruptive to the United States as well if we, went sort of up the chain to some of the bigger Chinese institutions. So, I think I said this earlier, we need a comprehensive diplomatic approach to China that includes both carrots and sticks to bring them along on this effort, and it will involve trade-offs on other issues. The what more can be done, where's Ellen, where'd she go? There she is. What more can be done, or what more, could the Obama administration have done? Look, it was getting towards the end, and we took some steps, but we were also mindful that there was a new administration coming in, and we were hopeful that they would recognize the significance of this issue, and wanted to leave some opportunity for the new president and his team to to demonstrate that they too found the Russian interference in the election to be intolerable. So I think there's a lot more that can yet be done. So I'm not going to. There are a lot of things that can be done. There are things in the sanctions realm. There are things in the policy realm. There are things in sort of across the. If you think across the tools of American power that we can do. I'm not prepared to sort of give a prescription of the specific steps that this administration can do today. But there's a lot that's left in the chamber that hasn't been used.
And one thing that cannot be done is an extension of our time. But thank you so very much, David, for coming. Thank you all. This was a wonderful conversation.
Thanks.
Thank you.